In 1945, President Harry Truman allowed France to attempt reestablishment of France's pre-war colonial empire in Indochina after the Japanese had kicked them out during World War II. As soon as the French arrived back into Vietnam, fighting broke out against the Ho Chi Minh forces. At first, the United States remained neutral. However, Truman's key policy in 1947 was to assist any country whose stability was threatened by communism. Fearing that Vietnam would become a communist state, he sent over transport planes and jeeps, along with 35 military advisors, as part of a multi-million-dollar aid package. U.S. involvement in the conflict would escalate. By the end of Truman's presidency, the United States was funding more than 80% of France's cost. In 1954, the French suffered a catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu, bringing their colonial reign to an end. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who succeeded Truman, refused to involve the United States in another major conflict after the Korean War experience. He stated, "I am convinced that no victory is possible in that kind of theater." However, Eisenhower subscribed to the domino theory, which held that if one country fell to communism, then its neighbors would follow. That meant if Vietnam fell, then Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand would fall. So he refused to abandon Vietnam altogether. The nation was partitioned in two, with Ho in control of the north and pro-Western leader Diem in the south. Even though Diem proved corrupt and authoritarian, Eisenhower supplied his regime with money and weapons, sending nearly $2 billion in aid, increasing the number of military advisors to around 1,000. By the time Eisenhower left office, open fighting had broken out between Diem's forces and the so-called Viet Cong, who were communist insurgents in the south, backed by North Vietnam. Each side employed brutal tactics, including torture, political assassinations. The Vietnam War was in full swing, and the United States was right in the middle of it. The next president, John F. Kennedy, declared, "I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere." He changed his mind, however, by the time he ran for president in 1960, due to concerns he would be called soft on communism. Once in the White House, Kennedy provided South Vietnam with jet fighters, helicopters, armored personnel carriers, river patrol boats, and other tools of war. He also authorized the use of napalm as well as deployments, such as Agent Orange. Under his watch, the number of military advisors rose to about 16,000, and some began engaging in clandestine combat operations just weeks prior to President Kennedy's assassination. When Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War was limited. Then the Gulf of Tonkin incident prompted Congress to grant substantial war-making powers to the president. Recognizing that the South Vietnam government and army were on the verge of collapse, Johnson sent the first U.S. combat troops into battle in early 1965. He simultaneously authorized a massive bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder. The B-52s started dropping bombs on North Vietnam. That would continue for years. It was a massive bombing campaign. Draft calls soon went through the roof, along with draft resistance. And by 1967, there were around 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. That same year, large anti-war demonstrations popped up in cities, and U.S. officials kept insisting that victory was near. But as the Pentagon Papers would later reveal, these comments were very misleading. The conflict had devolved into a quagmire. Vietnam became so polarizing that President Johnson decided not to run for re-election in '68. Richard Nixon campaigned for the White House, promising to end the Vietnam War. As president, Nixon gradually withdrew American troops as part of his policy of Vietnamization. Yet he escalated the conflict in other ways, approving secret bombing runs of neighboring Cambodia and Laos and other incursions. Nixon also ordered the most intensive air assault of the war, pummeling cities in North Vietnam with roughly 36,000 tons of bombs in 1972. Then in January of 73, as the Watergate scandal was heating up, Nixon finally ended direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam, saying peace with honor had been achieved. As it turned out, though, fighting continued until 1975, when North Vietnamese troops marched into Saigon. And an American evacuation was called for. It was much like the Afghanistan debacle. South Vietnam was reunified with North Vietnam under communist rule. Now the results of the Vietnam War. On November 11, 1984, while President Reagan was dedicating the Vietnam Wall, Defense Secretary Weinberger was laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. In his remarks, he said, "A nation which forgets the sacrifices of its heroes risks its very existence." The Vietnam War is a story of service members of different backgrounds, colors, and creeds, draftees, and volunteers who came together to complete a daunting task. It is a story of Americans from every corner of our nation who left the warmth of family to serve the country they loved. It is a story of patriots who braved the line of fire, who cast themselves into harm's way to save a friend, who fought hour after hour, day after day, to preserve the liberties we hold dear. In our nation's capital and in communities crisscrossing America, we find monuments dedicated to soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, and Coast Guardsmen who served their country in the Vietnam conflict. One such monument is the Vietnam Veterans Wall, which sits in Constitution Gardens, adjacent to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Simply called the Vietnam Memorial Wall, it consists of two angled pieces of polished black granite, each over 246 feet long, that angles out and tapers from its apex and is etched with the names of our fallen brothers and sisters from the Vietnam War. As of Memorial Day 2017, there are 58,318 names listed on the 44 panels of that polished black granite wall. The names are arranged in order in which they were taken from us by date, and within each date the names are alphabetized. It is hard to believe it has been 68 years since the first casualty. The first known casualty was Richard B. Fitzgibbon of North Weymouth, Massachusetts, listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as having been killed on June 8, 1956. His name is listed on the wall with that of his son, Marine Corps Lance Corporal Richard B. Fitzgibbon III, who was killed on September the 7th, 1965. There are three sets of fathers and sons on the wall. 39,996 on the wall were just 22 years of age or younger. 8,283 were just 19 years old. The largest age group, 33,103, were 18 years old. 12 soldiers on the wall were 17. 5 soldiers on the wall were only 16. One soldier, Private First Class Dan Bullock, was only 15 years old. 997 soldiers were killed in their first day in Vietnam. 1,448 soldiers were killed on their last day in Vietnam. There are 31 sets of brothers on the wall. That means there are 31 sets of parents that lost both of their sons. There are 54 soldiers on the wall that attended Thomas Edison High School in Philadelphia. Makes you wonder why so many from one high school. 8 women on the wall, brave and dedicated nurses who cared for the wounded and gave comfort to the dying. 244 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. 153 of them were on the wall. Billsville, Ohio, with a population of 475, lost 6 of their native sons. There are 3,417 Texans on the wall. The most casualty deaths for a single day occurred on January 31, 1968, day 1 of the Tet Offensive. 245 Americans died that day. The most casualty deaths for a single month came during phase 2 of the Tet Offensive. The 31 bloody days of May 1968 saw 2,415 Americans killed. For most Americans, who hear this will only hear the numbers that the Vietnam War created. To those of us who survived the war and to the families of those who did not, we see the faces, we feel the pain that these numbers created. We are haunted with these numbers because they were friends, fathers, husbands, wives, sons, and daughters. Through remembrance ceremonies like we're having today, we find some solace in the sacrifices that they made. And through our comradeship and support of each other, we find healing. In closing, may we always remember there are no noble wars, just noble warriors. On behalf of the Department of Texas and Veterans of Foreign Wars, I thank our Vietnam veterans for their service and their sacrifice. It is because of them, through their experience and efforts, that today we ensure today's troops are honored and taken care of when they return home. Thank you and God bless.